Here's what nobody wants to admit about Christopher Moltisanti. The signs of him flipping weren't subtle. They were practically neon. For years, fans have convinced themselves that Christopher died loyal, a tragic victim of addiction and Tony's growing coldness. But the show leaves behind a trail of breadcrumbs that doesn't just suggest betrayal, it practically underlines it in red ink. A hat that should never have been at that meeting. A murder so loud and sloppy it reads like a deliberate invitation for federal attention. A conversation about witness protection that sounds less like fantasy and more like a man rehearsing his escape route. And then, of course, the car that doesn't just crash, it flips over and over, as if the universe is spelling out the truth Tony refuses to see. So ask yourself, is it really possible that Christopher was just high, unlucky, and immature? Or was he already in deep with the FBI, wearing the same kind of wired cap they used on Masserone, walking into that final ride with Tony as a man who had finally chosen a side? Because once you understand the clues, from Adriana to JT to that cleaver hat, the question isn't did Christopher flip? The real question is, how did we miss it for this long? The question of whether Christopher Moltisanti flipped before his death sits in that sweet spot between overreading and exactly the kind of layered ambiguity David Chase likes to dangle in front of viewers like catnip. At first glance, it seems like a stretch. Christopher, the eternally aggrieved nephew, the aspiring auteur, the junkie with delusions of honor, an informant? Yet the closer one looks at the final stretch of his arc, the more the season starts to resemble a very deliberate setup. A man who is isolated, cornered, humiliated, and then very possibly wired, both figuratively and literally. The most obvious visual cue sits right on his head. Christopher's last night on Earth, he shows up wearing a cleaver baseball cap. By itself, fine, but The Sopranos almost never does anything by itself. The only other prominent example of a character wearing a ball cap in a high-level setting is Jack Masserone and his ludicrous MOST, Museum of Science and Trucking hat, which the FBI uses as a wired cap. Masserone is eventually killed, yet the series never explicitly shows Tony discovering the hat trick. The implication is that Tony's crew eliminates the symptom and never understands the method. The hat is a device the viewer is allowed to understand more fully than the characters. Years later, suddenly Christopher turns up at a critical meeting. Tony, Phil, Butchie, New Jersey, and New York leadership all present, wearing a cleaver hat. Not just any hat, but branded merch from the film where Christopher poured his resentment toward Tony onto celluloid for future generations. It is an anti-Tony symbol, placed on his head at a moment when ball caps within this universe have been very clearly associated with federal microphones. That is not a wardrobe accident. That is Chekhov's baseball cap. The series quietly supports the idea that the hat is more than a fashion faux pas. Christopher is jittery at that meeting, visibly anxious and scanning the environment, yet not in his usual combative, half-lucid junkie way. He is nervous in a specific way, present but distracted, attentive to everything and nothing, like someone who is suddenly aware the stakes of every sentence have multiplied. This is also the scene where he takes an uncharacteristically dovish posture toward Phil. This is the same man who previously bragged that he was not afraid of New York's 200 soldiers, and openly nursed a violent hatred of Phil Leotardo for threatening to ram a disc man somewhere unmentionable. Now, in the car with Tony, he is recommending peace, telling Tony to meet Phil's number on the asbestos dispute, musing that life is too short, parroting Tony's own stop and smell the roses philosophy. Suddenly, the proudly reckless hothead has turned into a risk-averse mediator. Informants, after all, are not supposed to advocate for escalating violence. They're supposed to gather information while minimizing carnage, especially the kind that complicates ongoing investigations. Placed in isolation, this shift could plausibly be blamed on drugs, fatherhood, or a newfound spiritual awakening. But the series has gone out of its way, in the preceding episode Walk Like a Man, to underline that Christopher does not have a spiritual awakening. he has a rupture. That episode systematically strips him of almost all meaningful connections, one scene at a time, and then calmly places a gun in his hand. The pattern begins at the Bing. Paulie needles Christopher for not having a real drink, mocking his club soda and essentially branding sobriety as weakness. Christopher storms out, and in the very same episode, Tony is shown collaborating with the FBI over Ahmed and Mohammed, casually feeding them information about suspected terrorists. When Tony needs phone numbers, he calls Christopher. Christopher realizes Tony is speaking to the feds, and the theme of who is talking to whom is quietly planted. From there, the show proceeds to remind Christopher precisely how expendable he is. At his housewarming party, he sees Tony and Bobby deep in business conversation. The message is unsubtle. Bobby, the man who once fetched stool softener for Junior, is now being groomed into the inner circle, while Christopher stands on the outside of his own home, watching. Tony then belittles his sobriety directly, compares giving up alcohol to not being able to eat eggplant, tells him to show some balls, and mocks his non-alcoholic beer. In a moment of brutal honesty, Christopher reveals that his father Dickie was a junkie, just like him. It is as if he is offering his lineage as both explanation and indictment. This is who he is, and Tony finds it contemptible. The indignities keep coming. His father-in-law is leaned on by little Paulie to hand over power tools, a petty score that symbolizes how little respect Christopher commands. He demands a cut, he is brushed off. When he attempts to take the matter to Tony, he finds Tony in conference with Silvio and Bobby. Again, he is laughed off. His concerns are treated as a nuisance. In AA, the one space theoretically built to heal him, he finds the language to describe his own punishment. His sobriety has taken food out of his daughter's mouth. He chose Tony over Adriana, the one person who ever truly related to him, and that sacrifice goes unrecognized. The show does not need a monologue to explain his growing resentment. It just shows him being ignored, dismissed, and humiliated. When little Paulie again robs his father-in-law, Christopher's response is sudden and vicious. He throws him out a window and nearly paralyzes him. The amends with Paulie at the Bing are a theatrical reconciliation, not a real one. Christopher forces himself to drink to fit in, compromising the one thing, sobriety, that gave him a thin sliver of moral ground. The men joke that his daughter will grow up to work at the Bing. Even Benny laughs at him. Whatever illusion of respect he once held evaporates. This is a man who has lost his girl, his self-respect, his status, and now even the fantasy that the family cares about his actual family. Then comes the fulcrum, the conversation with JT Dolan. Christopher vents about flipping with a startling level of specificity. He references Sammy Gervano in his mispronunciation, living comfortably in Arizona under witness protection, basking in the sun, closer to Hollywood. He talks about the government program having money to burn. This is not idle fantasy. It is researched fantasy. It is the fantasy of someone who knows exactly what a golden ticket out looks like. He spells out, almost clinically, how easy flipping would be for someone in his position, and how appealing the trade would be. Out of New Jersey, away from Tony, closer to the dream factory he has always worshipped. JT, however, is not interested in being his confessor. He is exhausted by Christopher's drama, dismissive of his pain, and uninterested in hearing yet another monologue about Tony. At that moment, Christopher realizes something terrifying. Even this last, tenuous link to a different life, a writer, a friend from AA, someone associated with Hollywood, cannot or will not see him. Adriana is dead because of him. Tony is phasing him out. The guys laugh at him. His AA confidant wants him to shut up. He is, in every sense, alone. So he kills JT. On the surface, it is another reckless, drug-fueled impulse murder, but it is also strategically idiotic in such a pointed, exaggerated way that it functions like a signal flare. Christopher uses an unsilenced pistol in an apartment building with neighbors and potential witnesses in a city where law enforcement is not exactly asleep. JT's girlfriend knows Christopher visits. JT has real Hollywood credits. He is a recognizable civilian, a television writer with mob-adjacent connections through Cleaver. The murder is loud, messy, and public. Christopher walks out as if disposal is someone else's department, as if being dead to rights is no longer a concern. And then, nothing. No blowback, no tense conversation with Tony, no panicked cleanup. No news story about a murdered Hollywood writer with underworld ties. Compare that to Tony's elaborate disposal of Ralph Cifaretto. The chopping, the chemicals, the animal feed. Ralph was a made man. The stakes were enormous. Here, Christopher kills a well-known civilian in a way designed to leave evidence everywhere, and the show simply glides past it. The simplest in-universe explanation is that it did not glide past for the FBI. They scooped it up, wrapped it into a case file, and used it as leverage. The subsequent silence would be entirely consistent with a cooperation deal. The JT murder vanishes from the narrative not because it did not matter, but because it now belongs to another conversation, one between Christopher and the government. All of this makes the cleaver hat far less innocent. Christopher has form with flipping, even if only in aborted attempts. When Adriana confessed her status as an informant, she did so because she believed, on some level, that Christopher might join her. For a moment, it looks as if he might. He is devastated, furious at Tony, disgusted by his life. He seems poised to run. Instead, he pulls into a gas station in his expensive Hummer, fills up while watching a poor family get into their battered car, and makes his choice. He will remain on the side of the man with the money and power. He goes to Tony and sells out Adriana, sending the love of his life to her death and annihilating the only person who ever truly saw him. The series shows him over and over haunted by this decision. Later, sitting in JT's apartment talking about flipping, he clearly regrets it. He knows he made the wrong choice at that gas station. The tragedy is not that he never considered flipping. It is that he considered it, rejected it, and then had to live inside that cowardice. By the time he sits with JT and delivers his witness protection monologue, he has come full circle. The difference now is that he has something he did not have before, a monumental mistake to avenge, and nothing left to lose. Killing JT can be read as a grotesque act of self-sabotage. If he flips now, he will not be the guy who surrendered Adriana for nothing. He will be the guy who finally cashes in his suffering, takes the ticket, and lets everyone else pay. That also explains the logic behind his final car ride. Christopher has cocaine in his system, not heroin. Coke, in theory, should make him more aggressive, more volatile, more himself. Yet he is subdued, philosophical, pushing Tony toward compromise, tinkering endlessly with the stereo, leaning the audio toward the right channel, as if he is torn between broadcasting and suppressing. He chooses the soundtrack to The Departed, a film whose entire premise hinges on a mob boss and his protege secretly working with law enforcement in parallel. The symbolism is not exactly subtle. The Departed disc, like the cleaver hat, is planted earlier and then reappears at a key moment. The film is practically screaming into the frame. Are we all clear on the theme here? Then the car flips. Not once, but multiple times. Christopher flips the car. Christopher flips his loyalty. Christopher flips out of this world. It is allegory in blunt force trauma form. After the crash, he is gravely injured, impaled, and yet his first articulated concern is not blood loss, but his driver's license. He tells Tony he needs a cab because he is high and afraid of losing it. The notion that Christopher Moltisanti, a made man with a six-figure vehicle, a record of homicide, and a colossally fragile ego, is suddenly panicked about traffic penalties is risible. What he is actually afraid of is very simple: paramedics finding a wire. He even volunteers his drug use to Tony, a man who once beat him savagely for getting high after Adriana's death, which is something Christopher would normally conceal at all costs. The only reason to confess to something guaranteed to enrage Tony is to conceal something even more dangerous. No one lies by telling a smaller truth unless there is a larger one hiding behind it. Tony, of course, solves the problem in the most straightforward way available. He kills Christopher. To Tony, by this point, Christopher is not a beloved nephew. He is a liability, a number on the ledger. The show has been quietly pummeling this point. Bobby has supplanted him as a trusted lieutenant. The marriage to Kelly has not redeemed him. His film has permanently alienated Tony, and his drug use has, in Tony's eyes, become unforgivable. Tony's own sense of cosmic immunity, surviving gunshots, car crashes, near-death experiences, has calcified into narcissism. He believes the universe has tacitly endorsed him. He can smother Christopher, roll away from the wreckage, fall to the ground like a big hunk of rich, isolated salami, call 911, and carry on. The rain that begins to fall after Christopher's last breath is the closest thing to judgment the cosmos will offer, and Tony is in no mood to interpret weather. The series even toys with the idea of him being a rat after death. In the finale, a cat obsessively stares at Christopher's photograph. Polly reads it as a sign of Christopher's ghost, an omen. Tony brushes it off with a casual explanation. There must be a rat in the walls. The image functions on two levels. A cat hunts rats. Polly imagines a spiritual presence. Tony, as always, reduces it to a practical nuisance. But taken in light of the flipping theory, both men may unintentionally be right. Christopher is the rat in the walls, structurally part of the house and yet fundamentally opposed to it, still haunting the organization that destroyed him and that he, perhaps, finally betrayed. To be fair, the counter-arguments are not without merit. One could reasonably claim that Christopher's hat is just that, a hat. After all, he wears a ball cap in his very first appearance in the pilot, when he and Tony chase down Mahaffey. There, the hat signals youth, immaturity, a kid on the make. He has no arc, this reading goes. He begins as an overgrown adolescent in a cap and ends the same way, just in a more expensive car. The hat, in this interpretation, is not a wire but a symbol of regression. He never grows up, never matures, never becomes the man Tony hoped he would be. Drugs hollow him out. Whatever potential he once had dissolves in heroin, cocaine, and self-pity. The cap merely bookends a failed life. There is also the argument that Christopher, however flawed, is ultimately loyal in his own warped way. He had one clean exit ramp, Adriana's plea to run. He chose Tony. To flip later would make that decision even more grotesque, rendering her death not only tragic, but pointless. For some, his tragedy lies precisely in the fact that he doubles down on the wrong choice and never escapes it. He is too impulsive, too hot-headed, too self-destructive to pull off the kind of cold strategic thinking that flipping would require. Whenever he exhibits genuine insight or clarity, counseling Brendan not to hijack a truck, delivering his memorable assessment of Livia, it tends to happen when he is high on heroin or sedated, not wired on cocaine. In Kennedy and Heidi, the toxicology report mentions coke, not anything that would lend him unusual lucidity. One could argue that the philosophical car ride is simply cocaine-induced drift, not criminal strategy. Others shrug at the theory for a more fundamental reason. In the world in which these characters operate, Christopher's death is not extraordinary. A capo with a massive drug addiction, a history of erratic behavior, a fiancé who is a federal informant, and a deteriorating relationship with his boss is not exactly a shocking twist waiting to happen. He is a walking statistic. The only miracle is that he survives as long as he does. Within that framework, Tony's decision to kill him after yet another drug-fueled disaster, a near-fatal risk to his boss, and the cumulative drain of years of disappointment is entirely justified by mob standards. Tony gave him more chances than anyone else receives in that world, and still, Christopher could not get out of his own way. Yet the overlaps are difficult to dismiss. The hat, the ball cap precedent with Masserone, the emergence of caps as specific FBI tools, the timing of the JT murder, the complete narrative silence about its consequences, the resurrection of the departed disc, the shift in Christopher's stance toward Phil and violence generally, The thematic focus on how profoundly important Christopher is to the FBI profile, a made man who doesn't really want to be in, obsessed with film, riddled with addiction. He is, as one could charitably put it, law enforcement's dream demographic. The show goes out of its way to remind the audience that the feds are circling him. He is not some invisible soldier. They know who he is and what he is. Then there is the cruel elegance of the car crash itself. Christopher does not simply die. He flips in a way that almost takes Tony with him. The wreck visually enacts the metaphor. Tony, who has spent the season collaborating selectively with the FBI, viewing himself as clever enough to outmaneuver both law enforcement and his own crew, finally meets a problem he cannot finesse. A subordinate who may have followed his example a little too closely. Tony's contempt for his audience within the show, his men, his family, even Melfi, mirrors, amusingly, Chase's own professed contempt for portions of the real audience. The theory that Christopher flipped leans into that contempt. Of course the signs were there. Of course the hat mattered. Of course the car flipping meant something. For an audience determined to take everything literally, the show obligingly provides a literal flip, and still leaves half the viewers insisting the hat is just cotton. In the end, whether Christopher formally flipped or not is almost secondary to what the theory reveals about his trajectory. He is a man caught between two fantasies: the romanticized mob family and the romanticized federal escape hatch. He sacrifices the love of his life to one fantasy, then flirts with the other when the first fails him. He is never fully loyal to anyone, including himself. He talks about witness protection as if it were a resort package. Sun, Hollywood, a clean slate. He imagines himself as a writer, a filmmaker, a father, a killer, a martyr. The tragedy is that he is, in reality, just another compromised middle manager with a habit and a grudge. And the system, both criminal and cosmic, has no patience for that combination. Whether the cleaver hat hit a wire or not, it certainly told the truth. It sat on the head of a man who had turned his rage against Tony into pop culture, who had betrayed the one person who loved him, who had been quietly demoted inside the family he worshipped, and who was dangling over the abyss between flipping and dying. The show may never confirm the hat was wired, but it does not need to. The real recording had already been made, on film, in blood, and eventually in the twisted wreckage of a luxury SUV spinning through the night. Christopher flipped, literally. Whether he also flipped in the eyes of the law is left, with malicious precision, entirely up to the viewer. If you made it this far, you already know the truth. Don't flip on this channel. Subscribe.